Hello, everyone. Can we settle down and get ready for our Green Talk? So I'm Barbara Murphy Wesley, one of the 100W instructors and the coordinator for the program. And I'd like to first remind you of a few things before I introduce our speaker. First of all, be sure to sign in with iClicker, okay? The sign-in has started. And secondly, after our talk, we'll have time for Q&A. And please do not leave before we get finished. You should be finished in time to get to your next class. But please be polite to our speaker and wait for the session to end. So I'd like to introduce our speaker for today, GreenTalk 9. This is Kiely Smith, and she's Bay Area Director for the Factory Farming Awareness Coalition, a graduate of UC Berkeley in cognitive science, and she has a lot to tell you about her background and what she does. So please give her your undivided attention, and let's give her a warm 100W welcome.
Good afternoon. Can everyone hear me? Is the mic okay? Okay. So my name is Kiely Smith. I am the Bay Area Director of Factory Farming Awareness Coalition. We are a nonprofit dedicated to education around the impacts of factory farming. And I do this by visiting a lot of colleges and universities and corporations around the Bay Area and talking about our food system and then the impacts of our food choices and our food systems as they are. And so today I'm going to start off by just talking about what factory farming is, what that term means, and what it looks like inside some of these factory farms, and then some of the environmental impacts of this type of system, and some working conditions, workers' rights, a little bit of social justice, and then some of the health impacts, public health and nutrition impacts as well, and then wrap it up with some solutions that are going on from a systemic level, a technology level, and even like an individual impact level that can make a change to hopefully solve some of these issues that are coming up. So I'm going to start it off by throwing this out there. Who remembers singing Old MacDonald as a kid? Yeah? Okay, most people. So when we think of farms, this is typically sort of what we picture, right? We're picturing like rolling green hills, cows wandering around, and it's also how we're marketed on most of the products that we purchase at the grocery store. So this crystal milk ad really implying that this is, you know, what the farm looks like where you probably purchase your crystal milk. However, this isn't what most farms look like anymore, right? So what we have now are what are known as concentrated animal feeding operations, also known as factory farms. And this is really just the practice of keeping tens of thousands of animals confined in as small of space as possible to produce the most product possible. And that's really just to feed that growing demand for these delicious animal products that you can get out of this kind of system. So to start us off, does anyone have an idea, I'll take guesses, how many animals are killed, or that we use, I should say, every year in the United States for our products, like our meat, dairy, eggs, etc.? Any guesses? 100 million? Okay, cool. Any other guesses? Yeah. In the billion range? Okay. Did you have a guess? Something like in the billion range? Yeah. 200 million. Does anyone remember how many humans there are in the US? 330 million, something like this, right? Yeah, so if you can imagine 330 million people in the United States often eating these animal products potentially 3 times a day, right? So it adds up to be a lot. Something like 9 billion farm animals in the United States. And this is, again, in the United States, this is our pigs, cows, chickens, turkeys, that sort of thing, not including fish. They're just measured a little bit differently, so we don't have a number on fish. But this is what we're dealing with, right? So it's a really huge scale. Globally, on the sort of lower end of estimates, you're seeing numbers in the range of 60 billion farm animals globally. But if 9 billion of that is here in the United States, pretty large scale, right? So our consumption rate here is much higher than most countries for these products. So out of that 9 billion, does anyone want to guess then what percentage of that is coming from those factory farms, those concentrated animal feeding operations? Yeah. Okay, 85 to 90, yeah? 95, okay. Any other guesses? Are you scared to guess now? Okay, something like 99%, yeah. So what that means is that essentially every product that we purchase that's coming from one of these sources is coming from a factory farm, be that, at a restaurant, grocery store, what have you, right? Okay, this is a quote from National Hog Farmer magazine, sort of describing the philosophy of really how farming has become. So it says, the breeding sow, this is a mother pig, should be thought of and treated as a valuable piece of machinery whose function is to pump out baby pigs like a sausage machine. So it's just really speaking to maybe how we get further in a capitalist farming world, I guess. So really the trademark of factory farming is this intensive confinement. We end up with things like pigs being kept in crates their whole life, well, or months or years at a time at least, that are too small for them to even turn around. This right here is a part of a dairy. So does anyone know what happens or what should happen before a cow can give milk? What has to happen? Yeah. Yeah, she has to have a baby, right? So once the cow gives birth, they'll typically remove the calf right away and then keep them in, at least the female calves, they'll keep them in these stalls to grow up into a dairy cow. The male calves will go into something like veal because they're not actually profitable for the dairy industry to actually grow them, right? About 80% of our eggs come from chickens being kept in crates like this, these battery cages. The natural sort of wild cousin, I guess you could say, of our domestic chicken is this guinea fowl in Southeast Asia. They produce on average about 10 eggs per year. These birds are going to produce approximately 300 eggs per year, an egg per day more or less. So hugely different than maybe they would naturally be producing. And they're going to live in these crates, about 7 or 8 birds per crate, about a year or two, at which point their egg production slows down and they're not as profitable to keep. So they will, at that point, go to slaughter and become some lower grade food product like dog food or something like this. Here are some baby turkeys kept in a cage-free environment, which I'll touch on next. So have you all heard of cage-free eggs before or cage-free chicken? Yeah, a good number. So there's a huge market for these other kinds of food labels, and that's really, the more humane labels that are being come up with basically by the industry to market products as in different forms, more humane, right? So this example right here is a cage-free facility. It's still going to be in an industrial shed, right? There aren't those cages that you saw before, the battery cages, but it's still going to be an industrial shed. It's still going to be sort of how you might think of like a factory-style farm. They're still going to be cramming in as many birds as possible, for example, right? Just to increase that product again. One sort of practice too that I highlighted here is this process of debeaking. So naturally, chickens, they like to peck right at the ground for nutrients or worms or whatever they're finding. And when they're kept in close confinement like this, they end up pecking each other, oftentimes harming or even killing each other. So to combat these unnatural problems, we come up with unnatural solutions. And in this case, that's just removing the birds' beaks to ensure that they're not losing product over this sort of thing. Another food label you'll see is free range. You'll heard of this one too. So this one is interesting. This is actually our personal, like, local free range eggs. Judy's Family Farm is up in Sonoma Valley up here. So if you go to Whole Foods or Organic Valley brand, I guess, wherever they're selling these sort of brands, Whole Foods, Organic Valley, that you can find eggs from this facility. So the packaging reads, "These hens are raised in wide open spaces in Sonoma Valley where they are free to roam, scratch, and play." But then here you can see the actual aerial view of Judy's Family Farm, which is sort of just these industrial sheds, right? The legal definition for free range means that the birds will have access to outdoors, but oftentimes companies will really, like, push the limits of what this means, right? So in some cases, just simply including a small door, maybe doggy door sized door on the outside of their sheds that the birds could conceivably exit through, although they're not necessarily spending any decent percentage of their life outside, right? And then organic, so some food labels as well, like 100% natural, also humane. These have actually no legal definition whatsoever, so they can put that on essentially any product. Organic, however, is going to be regulated by the USDA, and this really is going to mean that there's no hormones, antibiotics, or pesticides. Arguably marginally better for health and the environment, but really it's going to be, it doesn't mention anything about, you know, coming from an industrial type farm or not. So it can have still, in often cases, like equal effects on the environment and of course from an animal welfare perspective too. Okay, so I'm going to jump into then some of the environmental effects of all of this. So it turns out that raising animals at this scale in this way is incredibly destructive to the planet, right? One of the most destructive industries we have. Again, 9 billion animals in the United States. So this is more farm animals in the United States than there are humans globally, right? So these are like living, eating, breathing creatures that have an environmental footprint just like any of us. What these animals are eating is primarily genetically modified corn and soy. I'm sure you all are, as engineers, are aware that GMO is not necessarily like inherently a bad thing, but the way that we oftentimes use it now means that it's going to be an increased use of pesticides. So that's really like one of the side effects of this type of system, as well as that having a monoculture. So, you know, out in the Midwest where there maybe once was like prairies or marshes, now just for hundreds, if not thousands of miles is going to be just these two crops. Right? And we're growing primarily using this to feed our farm animals. When we have these like vast monocultures, this has all kinds of consequences. When you have a lack of biodiversity, you're seeing things like the pollinators dying, right? And also soil degradation. So the nutrients get sucked out of the soil being a natural carbon sink as well, which means that it's pulling carbon naturally from the atmosphere if it's healthy. In this case, you know, when that soil is really degraded, it's not going to be acting that way. So it can actually contribute to climate change in some ways too. So a main concept here is just that it's really inefficient to feed the human population using animal products. Okay, so for every 100 calories of corn or soy that we put into those animals, what we get back in actual, you know, food to eat ourselves is something like 12 calories for chicken down to just 3 calories for beef. And this is, you know, another way to think about this too is like, does anyone have a cat or a dog at home? Yeah, that you love. So if you can think about like all the food your cat or dog eats throughout their whole life compared to just the flesh on their body, right? So in terms of like the efficiency of resources, it's not a great use. So what that means, though, is that, you know, if we ate half as much meat, we would have enough land that's not now being used to grow corn and soy to feed everyone on Earth today plus an extra 2 billion people, and that's using like healthy foods like fruits and veggies and legumes that we can actually eat ourselves, not just corn and soy, since we can't really subsist off of that. So when we think about the growing human population, addressing things like world hunger, we really do have to eat lower on the food chain just to simply sustain like human life on the planet. And that's just math. So this also like a huge side effect of, well, not really a side effect, but to get land to grow all of that corn and soy, you have to destroy a lot of habitats. So, you know, for example, the leading cause of destruction of the Amazon rainforest is to grow crops to feed cattle, for example. And this is obviously sad because no one wants to see our beautiful rainforest being destroyed. And also, you know, for the native folks who do live and use those rainforests, that's also not good. But as well as that, you know, our rainforests are, you know, the lungs of the planet, right? They're breathing in carbon dioxide and really helping us balance out things like carbon in the atmosphere. And when we cut them down, we are really, well, it's actually emitting a bunch of carbon and then just contributing to climate change, right? So there's many different ways that this type of agriculture is contributing to things like climate change. So besides land, to grow all of that corn and soy, what else do you need? Water, yeah. So it turns out that actually because, again, of that resource use inefficiency, the number one thing that most people can do to reduce their own personal water footprint is actually reduce the number of animal products that they're consuming on a regular basis. So, you know, something like 1 gallon of milk being the equivalent of 27 showers worth of water, just through all of that, you know, growing crops, feeding the animal, and then processing, etc. Well, maybe we should save questions to the end. Okay. And so this is just an example, but again, that's not to say that you shouldn't like save water at home, but really that industrial use of water is the majority, like by far outweighs our domestic use at home of water, right? Okay. So after all these animals eat all that corn and soy and drink all that water, what do? They defecate. Nice. They defecate, yeah, they make poop. So there's a lot of waste coming out of our farm animals. And then I have a brief video to sort of show what exactly is happening with some of this waste and sort of give a picture to the scale of it. Let me just fast forward a minute.
Filming. You're looking at a lake of toxic pig feces and urine, the size of 4 football fields. That's because thousands upon thousands of pigs are inside of these buildings. Their waste falls through slats in the concrete floor, and it's flushed directly into this giant open-air cesspool. How many of these kinds of factories are there? In North Carolina alone, there are over 2,000. And the consequences are disastrous.
The waste falls through the floors. It's flushed out into an open pit, like a cesspool. It's easy for a big hog operation to have as much waste as a medium-sized city. Of course, the pit will fill up, so it has to be emptied, and they're emptied by spraying the liquid waste.
Yes, you heard that right.
If you're familiar with a garden sprayer, they're gigantic versions of that. So they're making droplets, fine mists out of this liquid waste, and that can drift downwind into the neighboring communities.
I shut my hog operation down, and I got out of it. And I couldn't I just couldn't do another person that way to make them smell that. It is a cesspool that you put feces and urine in, a hole in the ground that you dump a toxic waste in. And I've seen dead hogs in them and stuff like that.
People can't open their windows, they can't go outside.
I've seen it. I've talked to the people. I've seen the little children that say, Mom and Daddy, why we got to smell this stuff? You get stories like, I can't hang my clothes out. Feces and urine odor comes by and attaches itself to your clothes. And then people will say, we're scared to invite neighbors.
It can, I think, very correctly be called environmental racism or environmental injustice, that people of color, low-income people, bear the brunt of these practices.
This is where they spray animal waste on us. It's about 8 feet from my mother's house.
What is it like when the mist is?
It's like, you think it's raining?
Really?
You think it's raining. We don't open the doors or the windows, but the odor still comes in. It takes your breath away. Then you start gagging, you get headaches.
There are a number of studies of asthma and asthma symptoms, particularly in children near these facilities. Among adults, there are reports of several types of upper respiratory symptoms. These pollutants are affecting people's blood pressure.
Okay, so again, this right here is a hog farm in North Carolina, right? We're one of the states with the most hog farms in particular. Does anyone remember what happened last year in North Carolina related to weather? Yeah, they had a hurricane. So, I mean, does this waste look like it's, you know, protected or covered up in any kind of way? Yeah, not really, right? So when that hurricane's coming through, it's just picking up all that waste and spreading it all around the neighboring communities. And so a really important thing to think about too is, do you think that, you know, if one of these corporations came to really anywhere in the Bay Area and tried to open up a hog farm like this, well, what do you think people here would say, I guess? Yeah, they would be like, no, not in my backyard, right? We have people with all kinds of resources and activists that can really fight these corporations and stop them from opening up. So what that means is where they do end up opening up is in lower income communities where they may not have the resources to fight back, right? Or say, we don't want you in our backyard. And that's going to be disproportionately communities of color as well. And so whether or not, this is actually a picture of one of these facilities after a flood. Whether or not there is, you know, a flood like this or a hurricane that's spreading this waste around, that waste does get into the water supply either way, right? So there's all sorts of water contamination happening all the time. And so you've all heard of like what's going on in Flint, Michigan, right, with their water. And that's not agricultural. That issue isn't related to agriculture, but in agricultural communities, this happens all the time, where their drinking water is filled with things like pesticides or waste from these farms that, you know, they will get sick if they continue to drink that water. So this is really something important to think about too. Okay. The last thing that I want to mention too is, that I sort of touched on earlier, is climate change. So animal agriculture is causing more greenhouse gas emissions than all of the planes, trains, cars, trucks combined. And I sort of touched on a few reasons why that's happening, as well as that, you know, the animals themselves are emitting things like methane, right? Nitrous oxide is coming out of animal agriculture, really potent greenhouse gases. And then, of course, carbon dioxide as well. And again, you know, climate change does not affect everyone equally, right? So something we have to think about when we think about something like climate change is really that certain communities are going to be disproportionately affected by those effects. You know, lower income communities, communities of color, right? Can anyone think of, too, something that we've locally had to deal with as an effect of climate change, just like in our own community recently? Yeah, the fires, that's a good example, right? So something like the fires where there's smoke in the air, you're told to stay inside, or if you go outside, wear a mask, et cetera. But are there people in our own community who maybe can't go inside, right, and get away from the fires or the smoke? Yeah, maybe folks who are houseless, right, homeless folks out in the streets, or people who possibly work outside and they can't afford to just, not go to work that day, right? So this is also really important to think about. And so what it turns out to be is that, if we in the US ate no-meat cheese just one day a week, that would be the equivalent of taking 7.6 million cars off the road in terms of greenhouse gas reductions. So pretty huge when you consider relatively small, individual change. And then again, I focus on the US because obviously we're here in the US, so this is important, or it's relevant to our lives. But it's also, because of the scale in the United States and on a per person basis, what we're eating compared to most folks in other countries, our impact really matters here, right? And that just comes down to the scale here versus other places. So I think it's really important, I guess just my own personal opinion is just that because we have such a big impact compared to other people, that we should really probably take a little bit more responsibility for that impact as well, right? Okay. So I also want to talk about what it's like to work on one of these farms or in this sort of factory farming system. So so this right here is actually a picture of a slaughterhouse, which is going to be sort of the step after factory farming. Workers in this type of a facility have a really dangerous job. So has anyone ever written an essay for a long time and then gotten a hand cramp? I guess we type now, so maybe not, but does anyone get typing cramps? Is that a thing? I don't know. So, working in an assembly line like this, right? You're maybe in sort of an assembly line formation and you're having these animals' bodies come through. Maybe 3,000 or 4,000 cows are coming through, for example, right? And maybe if your job is to cut off this one leg of a cow, you're doing that action all day. You end up with things called cumulative trauma injuries, where basically your body is going to have stress in certain ways that makes it unable to, sort of like a cramp, right, where you're unable to sort of move. When you go home, you might not even be able to undress yourself, for example. Oftentimes not being provided adequate health insurance, and that's really an important part of this when you think about the dangers of working in an environment like this. Not a huge percentage of these workers seem to be women, but amongst those workers, very high rates of sexual violence and sexual harassment happening as well. This right here is a study from a Tyson beef slaughterhouse, I believe. Oh, both beef and poultry, actually, slaughterhouse. So on average in this slaughterhouse, they're seeing approximately 1 amputation per month of a worker. So either they're losing their hand or their arm, et cetera, from working with these incredibly dangerous machinery, right, that are meant to literally pull pieces of animals' bodies off off their bodies, and of course we're animals too, right? And then of course, just seeing a lot of traumatic imagery and violence all day long can lead to very high rates of PTSD amongst workers. And again, because they're not necessarily being provided adequate health insurance, also high rates of alcoholism and drug abuse too. So the late night cleaning crew, their job is to go through and just clean up the mess from, all those thousands of animals moving through during a day. They're oftentimes using undocumented workers for this type of work. Does anyone know why they might be doing this? I'm sure you can, yeah. Cheaper? Okay. Anything else? Wait, what? Nobody wants to do that job. Okay, maybe a little more desperate for work, something like this. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, okay, just to like avoid tougher regulations, like, yeah.
They can't sue the company if they have severe injuries or someone with injuries such as harassment.
Yeah. So if they are being mistreated or abused in some way by these corporations, if they're to go to the authorities and try to like report what's going on, there's a fear behind this, right? That like they could potentially be deported, or maybe their family might even be deported, right? So this is something that, corporations can sort of use as leverage against their workers and really as a way to exploit them. In one story, there was actually, first of all, has anyone ever driven down I-5 and sort of just like smelled the cows down there? Yeah, so yeah, Harris Ranch, yeah. So really strong. If you can imagine like what it smells like, a little closer in there too, pretty strong. So in one story, there was a worker at a corporation, National Beef Company, and his job was to go in and spray down with like hot water and bleach or chlorine, all of the mess from throughout the day. So he went to the top of a blood collection tank to spray it down, and he actually became overwhelmed by the fumes and fell inside the tank. 2 other workers saw what had happened, and they went to try to pull him out, but they also became overwhelmed by the fumes and fell inside. Yeah. So 3 men died, they drowned. The government fined National Beef for what had happened in their facility. For each man's death, $480. Yeah. So, I mean, first of all, does that sound like a lot for like a corporation to pay, right? No. So, number one, that's really telling us that, the government isn't valuing the lives of these workers. And number two, that really those corporations have no incentive to actually change or make their working practices safer for their employees, right? Okay. And then one other part of this is, has anyone ever like seen this documentary on Netflix called Walmart? It's about Walmart. It's called like The High Cost of Low Prices, I think it's called. Or just really familiar with how Walmart works. So with Walmart, they'll, oftentimes like promises of like tax revenue and communities and jobs and things like this, right? But then when they move in, the small businesses oftentimes go out of business because they can't compete with the prices of Walmart. So it's very similar with factory farming. When a large factory farm moves into a community, oftentimes those small farmers can't compete and they'll end up going out of business. And the other side of this too is like, well, does anyone in here want to live next to a factory farm? No, yeah, probably not. So what happens is that the property values when a factory farm opens up in your neighborhood, your property value really plummets. So even if like, maybe you're getting sick or something like this, not that you wanted to leave in the first place, but even if you tried to move out, you can't actually find like a buyer for your house, and you oftentimes can be stuck in these communities essentially, which can lead to like just more health problems, right? Okay, so I want to talk about some health effects as well. So one of the major effects is that the overuse of antibiotics. So in this industry, in the United States, I should say, about 80% of our antibiotics, I've heard 70 to 80 actually, percent are being used on our farm animals, not on humans. And this is due to just, the fact that the animals are confined in such tight spaces that diseases spread super easily, but also, they actually make animals a little bit bigger, so farmers like this. They overuse them. Long story short, it leads to antibiotic resistance, right? Has anyone heard of swine flu? Do you guys remember that? So that was called swine flu because it was traced back to a hog farm somewhere in Mexico. So things like MRSA happen, very common illnesses that when they come out of these factory farms and infect, workers and then come out into the rest of society, we can't actually cure them because we don't have antibiotics that are strong enough, right? And also, so these are the top 10 leading causes of death in the United States, okay? The ones in red, heart disease, cancer, stroke, diabetes, these are all directly associated with the overconsumption of animal products. So, you know, something like heart disease, folks who don't eat any meat, they actually have a 32% lower risk of death from heart disease than folks who do, which is huge when you consider this is the #1 killer in the United States, right? So really, again, it's overconsumption of these products. Not to say that if you eat one hamburger, you're going to get heart disease, of course, right? But overconsumption at a large scale is really leading to a lot of diseases like this. Diabetes as well, so people who eat wholly plant-based, so they're eating, you know, no dairy, meat, eggs, are going to have about a third lower risk of diabetes as well. And even cancer, so people who eat diets rich in animal products are going to have something like 4 times more likely to die of cancer, especially with processed meats, so that's like your sausages, bacon, nuggets, right? And then red meats as well. So that's like your beef, lamb, pork, things like that. Doctors at Kaiser are starting to recommend that all of their physicians tell patients that a whole foods, plant-based, that's sort of key. But plant-based diet being the healthiest diet all. And so another question that we get to is like, what about protein, right? So most Americans are actually getting about 2 to 3 times the amount of protein they need. So this is probably a little bit less of a concern than maybe it should be. But you know, plants also provide a lot of protein, right, for people. And you can get all the 9 amino acids you need from for proteins from plant sources. So this is just a brief video of this plant-based athlete movement. So I'll just show this really quickly.
I was really expecting it to end my career.
Transition, I wasn't sure if I was going to survive.
What we eat has a major impact on our health in every way we can measure. Today's blood and yesterday's blood.
To think that these elite fighting machines were eating mainly plants went against everything I'd been taught about nutrition.
There's no one that can relate to this better than I do because I've lived in that world.
I'm in it just to rewrite history, cause I'm in the mood to label us the leaders of the new school. This ain't for the radio, can't find this on YouTube. This the type of killing that these critics ain't used to. Victorious.
Okay, so I'm going to skip through kind of quickly here, but these are just some examples of, you know, foods that are high in protein that come from plants, legumes being sort of the most known probably, like your beans, your lentils, things like peanuts, soy. This is a map of countries affected by lactose intolerance. So the ones that are in the darkest blue are 80 to 100% of their population are lactose intolerant, meaning they don't process dairy, right? Which countries do you notice are not lactose intolerant? Yeah, the US, Europe, right? Yeah, so really like up here is where folks' bodies were adapting to consume a lot of dairy. And then with colonization, so if you can imagine before colonization, maybe the United States would have been a slightly different color, right, than Canada. But with colonization, that's when you're seeing those dairy products become really popular. Interestingly too, like what's the main thing we're told that milk helps us with in our body? Bones, right? But interestingly, places like China and a lot of countries in Africa have really low rates of like osteoporosis, for example, which is that brittle bone disease. And in places in the United States, where we have super high dairy consumption, have also very high rates of osteoporosis. There's also like no studies proving that, you know, if you drink a lot of milk, you're going to have fewer bone fractures or anything like this. And so these are some plant foods that are high in calcium, things like oranges, leafy greens, kale, and bok choy and things. And then, of course, they're fortifying products with these things now, and that's also a valid way of getting something like calcium. This right here is a chart showing the government subsidies through the US Farm Bill. So out of the subsidies that our government is providing to farmers to just like continue their farm's existence, out of that money, 63%, this big red chunk, is going to meat and dairy farmers, okay? This section right here, 20%, that's a lot of this is gonna be that corn and soy that's going to feed those animals. And then what the government is providing for healthy foods, so something like fruits and vegetables, for example, this tiny green sliver, less than 1% goes to fruits and vegetables. So this is, a huge systemic issue, obviously, leading to things like a Big Mac being cheaper than a salad, right? And it causes food access issues where, you have lower income folks who can't actually, get access to a lot of these healthy foods that we all need, like fruits and veggies. So this also has consequences, racial disparities between some of those health effects that we talked about. So like this chart showing diabetes across different races. You have indigenous folks, Asian, Black, Hispanic, and then white, non-Hispanic. So, you can see a clear difference in diabetes rates against different races, right? Okay. So I'm running a little low on time, but I want to wrap it up with some of the solutions happening. So, the main solution that we have is, the United Nations, for example, is suggesting that we half our meat consumption. So really a large part of this is decreasing the amount of these products that we eat, right? And this is purely from like a sustainability standpoint even, just the rates that we have now, we cannot feed the global population at the rate of consumption that we have, right? And it's also increasing all the time. The Green New Deal, have you all heard of this? Yeah, so this is just interesting, I thought, because most climate policy that we have does not address agriculture in any really form. It's mostly, oil and coal and things like this. The Green New Deal actually does mention this, so it is becoming more, part of the policy solutions, I guess, for climate change. So it's pretty general what they mention, but it's something like investing in sustainable farming and land use practices. So, pretty general, but hopefully more climate policy will start to address agriculture. There are places, so in San Jose here, we have something called La Mesa Verde Project, and there are a lot of small nonprofits that are popping up to try to provide for folks in communities that are lower income, primarily communities of color that don't have access to a lot of those healthy foods, like fruits and veggies, provide them, for La Mesa Verde Project, they're providing them with training on how to grow their own fruits and produce in their yard. So really to provide for themselves what the system's not providing to them. I'm gonna skip a couple of things. Has anyone heard of Meatless Mondays before? So this was a public health initiative created by Johns Hopkins University. They did a lot of research on the health impacts of over-consuming these animal products, and they decided if we can tell Americans to eat 1/7 less meat, that's gonna be great for everyone's health. So they put out this Meatless Mondays initiative, became pretty popular, usually wherever I go, someone's heard of it. Here in the Bay Area, we have a lot of food technology going on as well. So this is a company called Memphis Meats, based in Berkeley. They're creating what's called clean meat, also known as lab-grown meat. And they're essentially what they're doing is taking a living cow, taking some cells from that cow into the lab and just culturing the cells directly, and then growing the meat from that. So really they're, through this process, eliminating the entire factory farming industry, really, right? So you have something like 99% less land use, 96% fewer greenhouse gases and less water use. So this is a really, I think it'll be an important part of solving this problem because people do want to eat things like meat, but hopefully there are other ways that we can get them products like this that are not as destructive to the environment. Then we also have this whole world of sort of like plant-based products. So has anyone heard of like the Impossible Burger? Yeah? So they're basically creating products like a burger. It looks like meat, it tastes like meat, and it even bleeds like real meat, right? But it's actually based from plant proteins. And they're doing a lot of food tech on this, so it's not your 10 years ago like your tofurkey or something like this where it's just basically soy. They're putting all sorts of technology in it to make it as realistic as possible. So these products are already on the market, and it's like really a growing market for this. They're making a lot of money off this stuff. And something like almond milk too, like if you think about that map where, you know, something like 65 to 75% of humans are lactose intolerant, I would argue that having access to something like almond milk or soy milk or oat milk or whatever is really important for folks' health. So as these products are getting more popular, things like, you know, almond milk or soy milk are basically becoming more available to folks, and actually those prices are dropping too. So this is, I think, important too. Also, a lot of like fast food chains are getting on board, big companies. So like Carl's Jr. is offering the Beyond Burger in 1,000 of their locations right now. What was it? Burger King just announced like 2 weeks ago that they're actually also going to offer the Impossible Burger, or the Impossible Whopper, I guess they're calling it. So this is really a huge market as well. And then there are lots of things that we already eat. So something like a PB&J on whole wheat actually has the same amount of protein as a burger. So I think it's, you know, a misconception that you have to have a giant piece of steak on your plate to really have like a full meal. But there's all sorts of cultural cuisines that are, you know, super plant-based that you can get nutrients in a more sustainable way and hopefully healthier too, better for your health. And then a huge part of this also is just eating more vegetables, right? So really shifting, most people are not, it's something like 9 out of 10 Americans are not getting enough vegetables. So really shifting more toward these healthier foods that we all need, that we all know are healthier anyway, but they're also a lot healthier for our planet as well. Okay. And then my organization, just to really wrap it up, we're doing something called Green Monday. It's similar to Meatless Mondays, but we're working with universities, corporations, cities to offer plant-based meals 1 day a week. And that's part of, you know, for example, the city of Berkeley's climate action plan. And they're able to track their carbon emissions saved and all sorts of things related to that. So if everyone wants to, you can go to this URL and give me feedback on the presentation. And then while you're doing that, I guess if there's any questions.
Yes, we've got time for a couple of questions. Your fellow student there will take care of that side of the room. I'll take care of this side. But I have a question first.
Okay.
Can you explain a little bit about, in your job, what role does communication play, and why is it important, that sort of thing?
Yeah, so I mean, in my role, obviously I'm standing up here trying to communicate a lot of information, but just in general, I think like all of these issues, especially from like an environmental standpoint that we really need to educate the public on. I mean, I'm sure you're all aware, right? All of these, like climate change, for example, no matter how many scientists agree, as if we're not mobilizing the public, those problems aren't going to be addressed. So I think that's a super important part, especially for STEM majors like yourself, to really like be able to communicate these issues in a simple way that can show how important it is for folks to take action and hopefully solve these issues. Yeah, super important. Yeah.
What would you recommend an individual looks for when they go out shopping for animal products? Is there already an existing label that basically says that the animal was treated well during its lifetime?
Yeah, so this is a good question. A lot of those labels that are being, you know, produced, I guess, just to put on products are, it's possible that a lot of farms are like really trying to treat their animals in a certain way. However, like most most corporations are going to try to like push the limits of those definitions, right? So that's where you end up with things like free range being like a small door on the outside, right? Some free range farms I'm sure are like maybe chickens are outside, for example. But it's really hard to know. There are a few organizations, like there's one called the Cornucopia Institute that does sort of like they rate companies on, you know, animal welfare and sustainability, so that you can kind of know a little bit better. But yeah, unless you're like visiting the farm, I guess I don't have an exact answer because the labels don't really tell the whole story, I guess. Yeah. Yeah.
Hi. Is there any push for banning like advertisement of dairy products, kind of like, you know, how they ban advertising of cigarettes?
That would be cool. I think that's a cool idea. I don't know. Do you mean like a policy that would ban them?
Well, if you don't advertise it, unless people would consume it.
Yeah.
They advertise, just how they advertise guys working on plant-based diets. You also have guys who are working out, champion athletes who are consuming chocolate milk after a workout.
Yeah, I mean, I think that that's a really cool idea. I just don't know if there's enough like public support to mobilize people in something. It's something like the soda tax, for example, right? Where like you have to get a lot of public support for people that care about health to like actually put out a soda tax or something, some sort of policy. But I haven't heard of any like advertising bans related to milk products, dairy products, but that would be a cool idea. I think it just you have to have like public support really. So I think part of it is like educating people about it. Maybe if we had some like pro or some like positive campaigns about, I guess it would sort of be negative against the dairy products, but why it's not healthy or something like this, that might help. But yeah, cool idea though.
Hi, thank you for the talk.
Yeah.
My question is that, so they use hormones, antibiotics, and other stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Like, how much are they increasing the production by not going organic?
Oh, I don't think that they're necessarily increasing the production that much. Well, so I guess you mean of the animals in particular,
Yes,
like not all products. I mean, a lot of it has to do with the breeding of the animals too. So like those chickens that are being bred to produce 300 eggs or whatever compared to like their wild cousin, that's a lot of to do with just like genetically modifying in a way the animals. But yeah, I mean, they are given hormones. I guess I don't know the exact numbers of like what exactly is increasing. It's a combination of factors, I suppose, and just making the whole process as efficient as possible. Like keeping them in a small area makes it more efficient for them to just cycle through. Like when a chicken isn't producing as much, they'll send that one off to slaughter and then get a new chicken. So I guess it's a multitude of factors. Yeah, I don't know the exact percentage though.
Okay. It looks like we've got time for one more question.
So you know how like Prop 12 in the most recent election?
Yeah.
There was like a lot of controversy, or at least it seemed like it. Would establishing like a minimum space requirement have been progressive towards like animal rights?
Yeah, I mean, so I think the main pushback was from like PETA against Prop 12, and that I think their reasoning was just that they didn't think it was going far enough. But in my perspective, I guess, I would say like something like Prop 12 is pretty good. So so Proposition 12 in California passed last election cycle in 2018, and they're basically giving a specific size or space limit to farm animals. So for pigs, I think it was like 4 by 6 feet, for example, per pig. And then for chickens, it was something like 1 foot by 1 foot. So some sort of size requirements, I think, are progressive. I think also, like, once California adopts these laws, oftentimes they'll sort of trickle down to other states. So I think that's positive, just having something addressing some of these issues and like putting a little bit of pressure and pushback on these corporations. So in my view, it seems positive. Yeah.
Okay, well, everyone, let's give our speaker another hand. Thank you.
And also,
thank you, Kiely. And also, if your question, you didn't get a chance to ask your question, she'll be here for a bit, so you can come up, get a card.
I'll just say too, like my organization does have internships, and we love college interns. So if you're interested in getting more involved, feel free to like email me or check out our website. I'll just leave our little logo up here. But thank you all.
Okay, thank you. See you next week.